You were 22 years old and pregnant with your fourth child. Your husband had been dead for 6 months, killed when a tree he was cutting fell the wrong way. Now you stood in front of 3 men in dark coats who sat behind a table looking at you like you were something unpleasant they had to deal with. The magistrate in the middle held papers you couldn't read. Your husband's brother sat to his right, smiling slightly. The magistrate spoke. Your husband's property, the land you'd lived on for 5 years, the cabin you'd helped build with your own hands, the crops you'd planted and harvested, all of it now belonged to your brother-in-law. You had no legal claim. As a woman, you couldn't inherit. Your children couldn't inherit because they were minors. Everything went to the nearest adult male relative. You were being evicted. You had 1 week to leave. And when you tried to speak, tried to explain that you had nowhere to go, that you were pregnant and had 3 children under the age of 7, the magistrate cut you off. Women didn't speak in legal proceedings. You had no standing, no rights, no voice. You were escorted out of the room, and the door closed behind you with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. Colonial America in the 16 and 1700s was built on a system that treated women as legal non-persons. The laws inherited from England made this explicit. A married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She was femme covert, covered by her husband's legal existence. But even unmarried women and widows had severely restricted rights. Women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't testify in court in most circumstances, couldn't own property in many cases, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't control their own earnings, couldn't make wills without permission, couldn't gain custody of their own children if their husband or his family wanted them. The colonial legal system was designed by men, for men, to protect men's interests. Women existed within it only as dependents. Daughters belonged to fathers. Wives belonged to husbands. Widows were problems to be managed by male relatives or the community. And if you had no male relative willing to take responsibility for you, you were on your own in a society that gave you no tools to survive independently. The frontier was harsh enough for men with full legal rights and economic power. For women without those things, it was often a death sentence. Mary Hutchins was 22 when she became a widow in the Massachusetts colony. She and her husband, Daniel, had been farming a plot of land about 5 miles from the nearest settlement. They'd cleared the land themselves, built a small cabin, planted corn and vegetables. It was hard work, but they'd been managing. They had 3 children, a boy aged 6, a girl aged 4, and another boy aged 2. Mary was pregnant again about 5 months along. Then Daniel died. It happened fast. He was cutting timber when a trunk shifted and crushed his chest. He was alive when Mary reached him, but he couldn't breathe properly. He died an hour later, gasping for air while Mary held him and the children cried. Mary buried him behind the cabin. She tried to continue working the farm. She had no choice. The crops needed harvesting. The animals needed care. She worked from dawn until she couldn't see anymore, her pregnant belly making every movement harder. The children tried to help, but they were too small. After 2 weeks, Daniel's brother Samuel arrived. He'd heard about Daniel's death and come to inspect the property. He looked around, asked Mary a few questions about what Daniel had owned, then told her he'd be filing a claim. Mary didn't understand at first. Samuel explained it slowly, like she was simple. Daniel had died without a will. Under colonial law, the property went to the nearest male relative. That was Samuel. Mary and the children had no legal right to stay. Mary tried to argue. She de-worked this land. She de-cleared it with Daniel. She de-planted the crops that were ready to harvest. Her children had been born here. Samuel didn't care. The law was the law. He gave her 2 weeks to collect her personal belongings and leave. Mary went to the magistrate in town, thinking there had to be some mistake, some protection for widows with children. The magistrate looked uncomfortable but confirmed what Samuel had said. The property was Samuel's. Mary had no claim. The magistrate suggested she find a male relative to take her in or remarry quickly. Mary had no family in the colonies. Her parents had died on the voyage over. She had a sister in England she hadn't seen in 8 years. Remarriage wasn't simple either. She was pregnant, had 3 small children, and no dowry. She wasn't exactly a desirable prospect. She asked the magistrate what she was supposed to do. He said that wasn't his concern. Legal matters were settled. She needed to vacate the property. Mary left the magistrate's office in a daze. She had 2 weeks to figure out how to survive in a world that had just told her she had no right to exist independently. Mary tried everything. She went to neighbors asking if anyone needed help, offering to work in exchange for shelter and food. Most turned her away. A pregnant woman with 3 children was too much burden. One family offered to take her 6-year-old son as an apprentice. They'd feed him and eventually teach him a trade, but Mary couldn't come, just the boy. Mary refused. She couldn't give up her child. She tried the church. The minister was sympathetic but honest. The church had limited resources and many people in need. They could provide some food, maybe a few supplies, but not ongoing support. The minister suggested the same thing the magistrate had: find a man to marry. Mary's situation was becoming desperate. The 2 weeks were almost up. Samuel had already moved his own family into the cabin. Mary and her children were living in a linta Daniel had built for storage. It had 3 walls and a roof that leaked. November was coming. The cold was already setting in at night. Mary's daughter had developed a cough. The 2-year-old cried constantly from hunger because Mary's milk had dried up from stress and malnutrition. And Mary could feel the baby moving inside her, another mouth that would need feeding in just a few months. If you were Mary, with winter approaching and 3 children depending on you in a society that had legally erased your existence, what would you have done? Would you have given up your children to families who would take them? Would you have married any man willing to accept you, no matter who he was? Or would you have tried to survive alone, knowing the odds were stacked impossibly against you? Winter came early that year. By late November, snow was falling regularly. Mary and the children were still in the lean-to. She managed to get some supplies from the church, enough to last a few weeks. She traded the few items of value she had: a silver button from her wedding dress, a small knife Daniel had owned, for food, and a worn blanket. But it wasn't enough. The cold was brutal. The lean-to provided almost no protection. Mary would huddle with the 3 children under the blanket, all of them shivering, trying to share body heat. Her daughter's cough had gotten worse. It was deep and wet, the kind of cough that meant lung infection. She needed medicine, a warm place to recover. Mary had neither. The girl, whose name was Rebecca, grew weaker by the day. She couldn't keep food down. Her fever spiked. Mary held her and prayed, but prayers didn't stop infection. Rebecca died on a freezing morning in early December. She was 4 years old. Mary buried her in the frozen ground, digging with her hands until they bled because she had no shovel. The 2 boys watched, too cold and hungry to cry. Mary wrapped Rebecca in the thin blanket they'd all been sharing and covered her with dirt and rocks to keep animals from digging her up. Then they went back to the lean-to with 1 less child and 1 less blanket. But here's what makes Mary's situation even more cruel. The system that destroyed her wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Colonial society was structured around male property ownership and inheritance. This system served several purposes. It kept land consolidated in male hands. It ensured that property passed down family lines controlled by men. It maintained social order by making women dependent on men, which meant women had no power to challenge male authority. And it protected the colonial economy, which depended on stable property ownership and transfer. Women inheriting property would complicate these systems. Women might remarry and bring property into new families. They might make decisions male relatives disagreed with. They might, worst of all, demonstrate that women could function independently without male oversight. So the laws prevented it. And when these laws destroyed women like Mary, when they left widows and children to starve, that was considered acceptable. The stability of the property system was more important than individual women's lives. Mary wasn't a person to the legal system. She was a complication, a remnant of a property transfer that had been resolved. And if she couldn't survive without legal rights or economic power, that was her problem. Think about the rights you have today. the ability to own property in your own name, to inherit from family members, to sign contracts and make legal decisions, to have standing in court. Now imagine all of that stripped away because of your gender. Imagine watching everything you'd built taken from you, and when you asked for help, being told that the law doesn't recognize your existence. How long would you survive? Most women in Mary's situation didn't survive. They died from exposure, starvation, or disease. Their children were scattered to whoever would take them, often as unpaid labor. Mary lasted until January. The baby she'd been carrying was born in the Linta during a snowstorm. Mary had no midwife, no help, just her two surviving sons who were too young to understand what was happening. The birth went wrong. Mary hemorrhaged badly. In a warm house with a skilled midwife and proper care, she might have survived. In a freezing Linta with no supplies and a body already weakened by months of starvation and stress, she had no chance. The baby, a girl, lived for about an hour. Then the cold took her. Mary bled out slowly over several hours. Her sons huddled beside her, trying to wake her up, not understanding she was dying. A neighbor found them 2 days later. Mary and the baby were dead. The boys were nearly frozen. The neighbor took the boys to the town where they were separated and bound out as servants to different families. Mary was buried in an unmarked grave. No record was made of her death beyond a note in the church register. Woman, widow of Daniel Hutchins, deceased. That was all. Her struggle, her suffering, the fact that she'd been destroyed by a legal system that gave her no rights and no recourse, none of that was recorded. The system continued unchanged. More women became widows. More were stripped of property and left to fend for themselves. More died quietly with no one to advocate for them or even remember their names. And colonial society prospered. The property system remained stable. Land stayed in the right hands. Men maintained control over resources, inheritance, and family structure. The colonies grew wealthy and powerful, built on systems that treated half the population as legal nonentities. And history celebrates the colonists who built America, the brave settlers who tamed the wilderness, the founding fathers who created a new nation. It doesn't talk about the Mary Hutchinses, the women who worked just as hard, who cleared land and built homes and raised children and kept families alive, only to be discarded when they became inconvenient. Women who died because the law valued property rights over human lives. Women who were erased from history because their suffering didn't matter to the people writing the records. Even when America eventually gave women more rights, it came slowly and incompletely. Women couldn't vote until 1920, couldn't get credit cards in their own names until 1974 in many states, couldn't serve on juries in all states until 1975. Marital rape remained legal in some states until the 1990s. The foundational belief that women were less than full persons, that their rights were secondary to male property and authority, that belief shaped American law for centuries. And it started in colonial America, where the systems were established that would define women's legal status for generations. Mary died in a lean-to in the wilderness because those systems valued male inheritance over her life. And she was just one of thousands. Thousands of women whose names we don't know, whose struggles went unrecorded, who were sacrificed to maintain a social order that benefited men at the expense of women's lives, autonomy, and dignity. The colonies weren't built by rugged individuals overcoming adversity. They were built on the backs of women who had no rights, no protection, and no choice. And that truth is still buried, still hidden under narratives about freedom and opportunity that applied only to half the population. The other half, the women, they lived and died in a system that refused to see them as fully human. And that system's legacy is still with us, in every inequality that persists, in every right that had to be fought for, in every reminder that the freedom America celebrates was never meant for everyone.